how does the Zoom compare to the the audience that's physically here? For now, there's only one person, except for me, sitting in the room, but there might very well be people coming because the break started a bit later. So let's just give it like a minute or two, and then we can start, if that's okay for you. Oh, and in terms of the conference, in general, I'm actually not entirely sure in terms of physical and online presence. I would guess maybe 60% is physically here, 40% remotely, but that's just a guess. It will be something around this, so not too bad. Yeah, Puebla is a pretty nice place, but there'll be other INTH conferences in other places, and hopefully by that time the pandemic is history.
Can I say something? Can you look away from the microphone?
I'll be back in just a second.
No, I see. This guy named Friedrich. Have you ever encountered Friedrich von Petersdorff? No particular reason.
Hi. Sit wherever you want. Okay, everyone. I think we can start. Maybe some other people will trickle in. Our audience physically has doubled in the meantime. I can't say that. My name is Rafael Verbuyst. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Ghent University, and I work on indigenous peoples' activism and contemporary settler colonialism in South Africa. I want to welcome all of you to this panel, which is F1, the Digital and Historical Epistemology. We're gonna go until 6:30 Mexican time, so we have about 2 hours, and we'll have 3 people presenting on the panel today. In just a moment, I'm gonna introduce the speakers just before they speak. They will all have roughly 20 minutes to speak, but we have 2 hours and 3 presentations, so I won't be too strict on that. And if that's okay with you, I'm just gonna remind you when you have 5 minutes left. I've seen that on Zoom, if I write in the chat, presenters usually don't see that, so I might have to just gently interrupt you if that's okay. I'm very sorry for that, but that way we can keep an eye on the time. And then, of course, we have a Q&A sessions after all the presentations are concluded. So, let me introduce the first speaker of today, which is Pedro da Silveira. I hope I pronounced that more or less right. Pedro is a professor at the Department of History at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, in Brazil. His current research focuses on the relationship between digital technologies, especially visualization techniques, and the production of historical evidence in the forensic turn and in heritage settings. His interests lie in the relationship between new media and historical knowledge, especially in their understanding of traces, vestiges, and the problem of the materiality of historical artifacts when impacted on by digital media, as well as problems of the nature of historical visualization and historical understanding in the current media landscape. Okay, Pedro, I'm gonna give the floor to you. I don't know if you have slides, if you wanna share your screen.
Thanks, Rafael. Yes, I actually have some slides. I'll try to, let me see. Here is the program. Do you see this window?
We do. I see it, but there's been. Yes, we do see it. All of us, right? Okay, great.
A blank, almost blank slide. Yeah. So I'm gonna put a full screen and I'm gonna pass the slides and start my presentation. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for having accepted my presentation. I would also like to thank Rafael for chairing the session, as well as my panel colleagues with whom I'm certain I'll learn a lot at this afternoon, already night in Brazil. Last but not least, I would like to thank the patience of the audience for standing with us here on this remote way. I know that we are all fatigued with remote academic events, but unfortunately, the world we are arriving today is perhaps more unequal than before, and attending remotely is the only option I think we had to participate in this exchange. Nonetheless, I also strongly believe in the potential of digital media, in media in general, not necessarily to overcome physical distances, but at least to present something that could only be presented through these mediated means. Who would have thought that 2 years later, the main theme of this conference, historical knowledge and mediation processes, would become even more relevant? This long introduction is in fact a kind of overture to what I will speak today. What can history learn from media theory, Digital sources as new media objects, and title of my presentation, is actually a summation of the theoretical discussion I presented in my doctoral dissertation, defended in 2018, which I would have liked to have titled it, but it was rightly lashed out as a critique of digital historical reason. So what I'll present here should be set against that horizon. There is a broad, actually quite pretentious theoretical reassessment of the role performed by media and technique, of which I'll speak less today, on historical knowledge. What I call digital historical reason is a set of assumptions and statements that frame the way digital technologies and digital media are incorporated into historical practice. It assumes that nonetheless, the fact that there were many specific changes in the way historians do their work, mainly day-to-day activities concerning methodological tasks, there is a core set of values and practices that remain unchanged, and thus historical practice will preserve its identity. It assumes thus that despite all the visible changes, it assumes thus that despite all the visible changes in the way historians do their work, nothing has really changed. And history is still defined by the same objects and the same methods, with the consequence that even if we have novel kinds of sources, the tools that the historical tradition has developed suffice to study them. This reasoning seems to be a defense towards two contradictory claims, namely that because of digital technologies and because of digital media, such as the internet, everything changed, while on the other hand, the expected digital revolution in historical practice didn't come. And here I present a series of these assumptions and sentences that I collected throughout my doctoral dissertation, the introduction to it, in which these same argument is repeated. That is, there was a change, but nothing essentially has been transformed or has really changed. All the changes were superficial. They were related to day-to-day activities, day-to-day tasks, but what historians do, it is still the same, still identified by the same objects and especially the same methods. And it is really interesting. Here is one quote from Stefano Vitali, here from Serge Noiré. And it is really interesting. I'm not gonna read them, but what seems to me interesting is that the word ontology, which seldom figures in the historian's discourse, is presented throughout here as something that needs to be defended. So there would be a historical ontology of, or at least there would be an ontology of historical practice that remain unchanged. Here, another one. here from Francisca Heimburg and Miriam Ruiz. So to say it bluntly, there was not a, there won't be a fundamental change in the epistemology of historical research. And from Anacleto Pons, also there was no ontological variation, only maybe a epistemological one. So this is the main set of quotes I would like to bring to this presentation. There are many others I could bring to this today, but I'll return to my presentations, to reading my presentation. So before this next slide, both seeing convoluted responses to two major reactions towards technology, technophobia and technophilia, which, as French philosopher Gilbert Simondon stated, are inadequate responses to the questions raised by techniques, mainly because it assumes that culture or the humanistic tradition should be guarded against technique. It is possible to see this, for instance, in the dismissal of theory in many of the discussions of digital humanities in the late aughts and early 2010s. In these debates, digital technologies were reduced to the status of tools. The question was, do they work? What they do, actually. Therefore, showcasing a less or diminutive understanding of technique, all the while also diminishing the humanistic critical claims to a technocratic understanding of knowledge as the verification of hypotheses. It disfigures, to think with Joanna Drucker, it disfigures to think with Joanna Drucker both what digital technologies are and what historical and or humanistic practice should be. The institutional emergence of digital history involves another set of reductionistic claims, to which I'll refer now. These claims are expressed in the oblivion of former practice that also combine historical knowledge and computation. In the US, these oblivions made most explicit in the reactions towards Time on the Cross by Robert Fogel and Stanley Engelman, which acquired the tone of cautionary tale regarding the derangement of historical practice because of the over-reliance on technology. While this episode is indeed instructive, the conflation of digital technologies with the internet, especially the internet in its commercial form as it appeared in the early to mid-1990s, creates an artificial break with the longer-term engagement of historians with computer technology. It is also damaging because it obfuscates which changes could have happened where they could happen in the future. Take the case of historical sources. A category that suffered major overhaul not only in cliometrics, but also in French language, serial history, and quantitative history. In the later cases, the uniqueness of the document was reduced into an extracted numerical value, part of a series of variables that, when put next to each other, could yield insights not gained otherwise. Despite the many technical hurdles that compromise its development, I want to point out how radical a break with the traditional conceptualization of historical sources was presented here, and how different it is from the way digital sources, especially digitized historical sources, would be understood later. The reduction at the scale of historical investigation and the development of new approaches such as microhistory resulted in a new set of assumptions regarding historical sources. It was not only the obsolescence of mainframe computers that led to the demise of such large-scale studies made by serial and quantitative history, but a conceptual change that resulted in a new usage of technology, only to return in a somewhat contradictory fashion to a previously held understanding of historical sources. This should undermine any vision of historiographical change led by the presumed technological revolution, as if new approaches such as digital history were better than previous historiographical perspectives on computer, that used the computer. In the interval bracketed by serial or quantitative history at the beginning and big data at its ending point, there was a process of taming historical sources towards increasing computational capabilities. In contrast with the expression of numerical values set in practice by serial history, it became now possible to reproduce the contents of documents in full, giving the impression, that is, the technical illusion, of the restored uniqueness. This is especially valid for digitized sources, which could be introduced without major changes in key concepts of historical practice, such as very concept of what a historical source is, or the active role played by media technologies such as interfaces in their presentation. Once a researcher had access to historical sources, it all becomes, if it's possible to say, business as usual, only faster, cheaper, and larger. This leads to the last of the longest section of this presentation. The development, at least in the 20th century, of an increased reliance on content over the materiality of historical sources. This might seem contradictory because the widening of the understanding of what documents are is usually presented as one of the major triumphs of 20th century historical practice, an argument especially known by those formed in the analyst tradition of French historiography. Counterintuitive as it seems, however, the dismissal of philology and the proper establishment of public archives led to a lessening preoccupation with documents' provenance and authenticity, which were previously dealt with using the techniques of diplomatics. I'm not saying this dimension is more important than the interpretation of documents, but that with both digital-born historical sources as well as digitized sources, these concerns return through the back door. Also, the importance of content and interpretation resulted in what Dominique Lacapra calls a documentary way of reading sources. There is a kind of reading that understands documents as vehicles of information and not as rhetorical pieces that should be understood as textual and, dare I say, also medial and material practices. This is enhanced by the very expansion of the realm of historical sources. It is understood that there is nothing in documents themselves that sets them apart as sources. Rather, the transformation from document and source is made by the questionnaire crafted by historians. Because of this, there is no need to inquire into their operational performative nature. With only some calibration, a novel is read differently from a movie, for instance, which are distinguished also from historical testimony. Every historical source is the same. There is the place where the historian imposes their questions with the goal of extracting as much information as possible from it. This reinforces, to conclude my argument, an understanding in which historical sources are understood in relation to their context, thus crystallizing both concepts, text and context, as it is only necessary to question sources for what a review of the time and place in which they were produced. That's why I would like to recover the category of medium and its hypostatizing plural media as relevant to historical practice. This could be useful not only to deal with the challenges brought forth by digital technologies, but also as a way to think of historical sources overall. Actually, it is the emergence of the later form of historical sources, the digital historical sources, that permits us to adjust the focus to understanding previous configurations in which this category appears. This is a move, it is possible to say, that befits the philosophy of techniques, as represented by both Simondon, already quoted, and Bernard Stiegler, as it is modern technique that becomes the lenses through which previous forms of technique could be understood. In this sense, I would like to highlight two consequences of the concept of media to the way we think about historical sources. First, the increased attention to the opacity of historical sources, which is derived from the material and performative understanding of media. Media, usually in digital media especially, are dependent on a series of unseen factors. And this unseen is if one is focusing only on content. Among these factors, it is possible to name the devices in which they are presented, the infrastructures that condition the functioning of these devices, and the interfaces enabled by the combination of both. This is complemented by what Ashley M. Scarlett and Martin Zeilinger call digital affordances. That is, That is not only what enables digital media, but what these media enable in relation to the way we interact with our physical and social reality. This leads to the second consequence, which I frame as the need for a constant dialogue with media archaeology. Content-based readings premise upon interpretation acted upon a single document. This becomes increasingly difficult not only because of the sheer quantity of information, but also because the fragmentation of public sphere makes different content available to different people. Thus, instead of an understanding of meaning as derived, one could say, from mass media that is established by the sender and absorbed, with differing levels of criticality by the receiver, there is a situation which linguists call context collapse. Here, I think, for instance, the work of Quentin Skinner, maybe how it could be also questioned, think of this, among other historical approaches. But anyway, in the digital realm, this is mainly the result of the non-simultaneousness of the sending and receiving operations that constitute communication. For historical and or humanistic practice, this is relevant because it is a deep challenge to the usual presumptions of hermeneutics. This is the main lesson historical knowledge could learn, in this case, from media archaeology, as understanding is not premised upon the establishment of a common hermeneutical horizon, but as a medial, there is a technological and, I reinforce this, material operation. This operative character of media distinguishes it not only from what I term here content-based reading, which I described earlier, but also from usual practices of the digital humanities, such as distant reading, which transforms texts into metadata, or even digital hermeneutics and or scalable reading, which maintain the privilege of the historian over historical sources, as if historical sources were a form prone to be filled with content. With historical content. It is the historian that gives the historical character to these documents.
Pedro, you have 5 minutes left. Is that okay?
Okay, I'm already finished. I'm coming to the last paragraph. Instead, it is necessary to break away from understandings of historical sources that rely on fixed previous categories and see how they function, what they enable, what they disallow in the scenarios they create. This is especially important because despite the always increasing, always distributed capabilities of AI, machine learning, and big data, the attachment to interpretation and to the uniqueness of historical sources deviates us from understanding the role media and new media play in our historical experience. For historians, this means that we should not try only to understand, for instance, this specific Twitter interaction, this video, or this meme, or this photograph, with the implication that all these forms of digital media say something about politics, culture, or society. Rather, we should ask what politics, culture, or society mean when we have such technologies at our disposal. What were the conditions for the appearance of these technologies? What they say about historical present, soon to be our historical past? How historical experience influenced by these media forms, what their existence reveals that it wouldn't be revealed otherwise? How they mediate our access to historical reality and thus are historical, not only because of what they say, but also because of how they function and because of what they enable, what they afford. So these are the questions I think that we should be asking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you very much for that. I'm now going to give the floor to Friedrich von Petersdorff, and I will do the Q&A in just a moment. Friedrich von Petersdorff is a familiar face at INTH conferences, having attended all previous editions. He studied philosophy, history, as well as media. He obtained his MA in Marburg in Germany and is now an independent scholar. His research is mainly focused on the epistemological and theoretical questions regarding historiography. His aim is to achieve a better understanding of the procedures and the underlying structures involved in historical research and historical writing. He therefore analyzes not only the methodological requirements of historiography, but foremost the epistemological and temporal aspects involved. and he has previously presented papers on these topics and has published on Paul Ricoeur, Theodore Lessing, Nietzsche, Hitchcock, Popper, and mental time travel. Interesting. So I'm now going to give the floor over to you, Friedrich. Thank you. You're muted, I think.
Sorry. Good afternoon. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks.
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank all those involved for having organized and enabled this conference and for giving me the opportunity to present my paper. The title here of being mediated past and present in view of the future. Within the context of mediated history, I intend to emphasize and analyze two distinct aspects of the process of mediation. Namely, firstly, that not only historical representations, but also historical sources, be these digitalized or not, are mediated. And secondly, that a conceivably sense of unmediated contact with the past, as referred to in the call for papers of the current INTH conference, would require not merely an analysis from the point of view of mediation, but also from the point of view of historical distanciation. In particular, I would argue that these aspects, on the one hand, mediated histories, and on the other hand, historical distanciation, could be regarded as being intertwined, namely when viewing them as instances of the ongoing process by which the hermeneutical distance towards the historical other is being refocused and adjusted in the course of historical research and representation. I intend to analyze the intertwinement of these aspects by taking an approach based upon Paul Ricoeur's conceptualization of the historical operation. In other words, by referring to Ricoeur's rearrangement of the phases of the historical operation as initially devised by Michel de Certeau. However, in order to discuss these questions within a context not specifically dependent on epistemology of historical research and historical representation, I shall, in the first part of my paper, focus upon the theory of free worlds as developed by Karl Popper, as I would argue that Paul Ricoeur's distinctions of three separate phases within the historical operation, that is the process of researching and representing past events as undertaken by historians, to be considered as an instance of an application of Popper's theory. After having briefly presented Popper's theory, I shall then discuss how I would compare Ricoeur's distinction of three separate phases within the historical operation with Popper's concept, thereby underlining their structural similarity. In a further step, I shall then discuss and analyze the aspects as referred to earlier, namely regarding the mediation of historical sources as well as of historical representations, thereby focusing upon the question how the respective temporalities can contribute to either a too unmediated or to a more mediated contact with the past. This in turn having an effect on how a specific past is understood and how perspectives towards and upon the future are at hand. I shall now turn to the first part of my paper, namely to a brief account of Popper's concept of free worlds. I shall thereby rely solely, for reasons of preciseness and focus, on the wording of his theory as presented in the 1978 Tanner lecture delivered at the University of Michigan. Popper begins describing his concept of free worlds by declaring that he neither seeks to reach a monist view of a universe nor a dualist view. Rather, he proposes what he calls a pluralist view. Pluralist in this case, pluralist In this case, meaning that the proposed view of a universe would consist of at least 3 different but interacting sub-universes. These 3 worlds, being 3 different but interacting sub-universes, are world 1, the world of physical bodies, world 2, the mental or psychological world, world 3, the products of a human mind. World 1, the world of physical bodies, covers objects being so different from one another, such as a galaxy, a planet, a tree, or a work of art. Apparently, the objects within World 1 could easily, according to Popper, be subdivided in various ways, such as into the world of non-living physical objects. Such as into the world of non-living physical objects and into the world of living things. It is Popper's point, however, to emphasize the distinction between World 1 and World 2. Popper's concept of World 2, the mental or psychological world, covers the world of our feelings, of pain and of pleasure, of our thoughts, of our decisions, of our perceptions and our observations. In other words, the world of mental or psychological states or processes, or of subjective experiences. This world too, as well, could be further subdivided, such as by distinguishing, for example, human consciousness from animal consciousness. It is, however, Popper's intention, by distinguishing World 2 from World 1, to underline the specific significance of the mental world, the world of subjective experiences. In a further step, Popper then distinguishes, on the one hand, experiences, World 2, and products of a human mind, World 3, such as languages, tales, and stories, and religious myths, scientific conjectures or theories, songs and symphonies, also aeroplanes and airports, and other objects of engineering. Despite the clearly defined scope of these 3 worlds, one should keep in mind that the contents of each one of these worlds are, in Popper's words, interacting. For example, a painting is an object within World 1, but also a product, World 3, of human experiences, World 2. Or a painting can be discussed and judged regarding its quality. In other words, a painting can an object of World 1, a product deriving from World 2, considered as realized being hence within World 3, can furthermore be discussed and judged by points of view, arguments, or theories. Following this short overview of Popper's concept, I shall now turn to the second part of my paper, Paul Ricoeur's concept of 3 historical phases. Ricoeur, in his book Memory, History, Forgetting, from the year 2000, as well as in his earlier work on Time and Narrative, 1983 to 1985, analyzed various questions related to history and historiography, thereby focusing as well upon the actual process of historical research. Within this process of historical research, Ricoeur distinguishes 3 phases: the documentary phase, followed by the phase explanation of an understanding, and finally the historian's representation. Ricoeur characterizes these phases in the following way. A. During the documentary phase, the historian looks for the available sources in question and will critically analyze them in order to establish the authenticity. B. In the next step, the archival content is ordered and arranged in such a manner that significant questions can be asked, answers to which will hopefully be found in the sources. Before finally C, the historian outlines his or her findings in a narrative. Separating these different phases in such a way is, in Ricoeur's own words, not a question of distinct chronological stages, but of methodological moments interwoven with one another. This interwovenness or intertwinement clearly becomes apparent when taking a closer look at the second phase, explanation understanding. This middle phase is characterized in such a way that the historians, when trying to explain and to understand, will sometimes have to return to the sources or even proceed to the phrasing of the findings before then attempting to gain a revised view of what has yet been achieved regarding the phase of explanation and understanding. The third phase, the historian's representation, will finally be a written version presenting the results of a previous research. Ricoeur, in the course of his analysis regarding the various steps of historical research and historiography, came to the conclusion that these steps could best be understood when viewing them as different but nonetheless intertwined moments of the triadic process, namely, as already mentioned, consisting of A, the documentary phase, B, the tasks of explanation and understanding, and C, the historian's representation. When comparing the framework of these concepts by Popper and Ricoeur, I would argue that the following similar aspects are quite apparent. The triadic structure, the clearly defined content of the respective parts, but being nonetheless intertwined, both kinds of approach being based upon methodological aspects of a character I would consider not to be ontological, but epistemological. To further outline these apparent similarities, I would like to underline the following points. Triadic structure, both concepts are presented in this form. The respective content of the various levels is precisely defined, thereby, however, not hindering the possibility for the individuals, the researchers, to refocus their point of view whenever questions need to be asked from a different perspective. Intertwinement based upon methodological aspects, I would argue that it is both Popper's as well as Ricoeur's intention not only to enable a refocus of perspective, but furthermore to underline the ongoing need to adapt the focus and to actually perform and carry out such moments of refocusing. Methodological aspects, the purpose of refocusing the point of view, that is in this case moving from one element of a triadic structure to another one, is not a question of ontology. Neither Popper nor Ricoeur aim at finding answers to ontological questions. Rather, both triadic concepts have been developed as a result of an analysis and a description of research procedures. I would argue that Ricoeur's concept of the distinct but intertwined phases of a historical operation is not merely regarding its structure, similar to the structure to Popper's concept of three distinct but interacting worlds, but does represent indeed an application of Popper's theory. Especially, I would like to emphasize that Popper's theory is in a certain way, at least, not limited, not bound by a kind of linearity, which, however, I would argue is apparent in Ricoeur's concept of the historical phases. Although Ricoeur underlines the processes of research and representation, there is nonetheless a certain temporal linearity apparent in Ricoeur's concept. As Ricoeur emphasizes the starting point of any historical study, namely a memory considered as being, quote, the birthplace of history, unquote. However, Popper, in contrast to Ricoeur, develops his theory of three worlds, I would argue, without a specific linearity. In distinguishing world one, the world of physical bodies, world two, the mental or psychological world, and world three, the products of a human mind, Popper, in his words, has a pluralist view of interacting sub-universes in mind. Furthermore, according to the example of these worlds interacting, as mentioned earlier, a painting is an object within world one, but also a product, world three, of human experiences, world two. or a painting can be discussed and judged regarding its quality. In other words, a painting, an object of world 1, a product deriving from world 2, considered as realized being hence within world 3, can be discussed and judged by points of view, arguments, or theories. The reason for having outlined the respective theories of Popper and of Ricoeur, followed by their comparison, thereby underlying the structural similarity, but also pointing out the differences, has been to prepare a discussion of those topics related to the conference theme I would like to discuss, namely regarding questions of mediated past and present in view of the future. As mentioned earlier, I would like to underline that not only historical representations, but also historical sources, be these digitalized or not, are mediated. Furthermore, I would consider it necessary whenever any aspects of process of mediation regarding historical representation or historical sources are being discussed, to have in mind as well the aspect of historical distanciation. In particular, I would argue that these aspects, on the one hand, mediated histories, and on the other hand, historical distance, could be regarded as being intertwined, namely, when viewing them as instances of an ongoing process by which the hermeneutical distance towards the historical other is being refocused and adjusted in the course of historical research and representation. Historical distanciation, when reflecting on the otherness of the specific historical past being researched, is not merely a matter, I would argue, of temporal distance or of hermeneutical problems occurring whenever the past appears difficult to understand and to grasp. Historical distanciation is also present, I would say, due to the various ways of how a specific past is being mediated. Despite digital sources being more or less omnipresent wherever available on the internet, this omnipresence should not result in or contribute to the blurring of historical distance. Rather, the omnipresence and ubiquitous accessibility of digital sources can in turn emphasize the mediated aspects of written, not digitized sources. In other words, I argue that it would be required in light of and due to the ongoing process of digitization of sources, as well as of representations having been mediated, to thoroughly reflect upon how any changes regarding an understanding of remoteness or nearness between a specific past and the respective present might either facilitate or hinder the emergence of new stimulating historical insights and views, these being required when addressing problems lying in the immediate or more distant future. Coming to the end of...
Excuse me, can you round off within 5 minutes?
Yes, only
Thank you very much.
10 lines. Coming to the end of my presentation, I hope to have sufficiently outlined 2 points. Firstly, not merely the significance of Ricoeur's version of the concept of a historical operation, but furthermore the additional significance of Popper's theory of 3 worlds, as this concept adds, I would argue, a flexibility to Ricoeur's concept, namely by not having a linear structure. Secondly, the intertwinement of the numerous mediations regarding historical sources as well as representations, and of the necessity of being aware of the numerous instances of otherness within historical research. In my view, Ricoeur's concept offers a good foundation to further analyze this topic of the intertwinements of the aspects of mediation and of otherness within the context of historical research and representation. However, this is a point I still have to further work out. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I look forward to the Q&A on that one as well. Let's first have the final presentation. which is by Jairo Antonio Melo Flórez. I hope I pronounced that correctly as well. Jairo has a PhD in history from the Colegio de Michoacán. His current position is Chief of Staff for MOOC. I apologize, I couldn't find what it is on the internet, but it is located at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and you can probably just give us a bit of background on the MOOC before you kick off. That would be kind of you, thanks. He's also a professor of digital humanities in the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico and the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. Jairo is a technical advisor in the Fundación Histórica Neogranadina and also in the Programming Historian project. Jairo is interested in methods, techniques, and theories associated with the digital humanities in relation to historical research. At the moment, he's focusing on the application of data science and machine learning for the analysis of historical sources in general and law in particular. Okay, Jairo, I'm gonna give the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rafael. I'm sorry for those Spanish, a lot of Spanish words, and it's very bit today. Thank you very much. I want to appreciate all the organizers of this event. After 2 troubled years, this was possible. And I think it's great that we finally have the possibility to meet today. It's a pleasure also to share the floor with Pedro and Friedrich, and it's a challenge also. I only hope that this presentation could be at least near to their level. Well, while I was writing this paper, the only thing that I could think about was what I'm thinking. This is a very great challenge because the proposal, the original proposal was machine-readable history, ML methods at mediation for historical analysis. This is way too far. This is a great. It's very difficult to approach all these topics. So this is like a sketch from this subject, but it's not the culmination of our research in that order. I want to begin with an image, and this is, imagine a future, perhaps not very far, where there is an historian sitting at his desk training his computer to parse a corpus of thousands of documents. An algorithm reviews in seconds millions of words, images, video snapshots, sound waves, concepts, phrases, ideas, to generate a result that can be close to the reading that hundreds of historians will have made in their whole lives. This perspective might well represent an utopia or a dystopia, but it's clear that interest, or at least curiosity, in data science and artificial intelligence models in historical research is increasing. Making historical sources machine-readable appears to be the next stage in the digitization of the world's historical heritage. Projects like Transcribus represent a perfect example of this effort, but there are also other companies and projects interested in automating the transcription of millions of manuscripts. Nowadays, manual tagging and human transcription remain the safest and perhaps on surface cheapest way to enrich textual data. TEI is a widespread standard that uses semantic tagging to generate non-relational data that could be used in humanistic research, such as searching for concepts instead of keywords, finding names and places accurately, retrieving metadata to create visualizations, or compare different versions of a document to find changes or matches. The TEA standard is widely used, but this is slow and has a low impact. A great advance is that anyone with just a few hours of training could start modeling documents with just a few technical tools to do so. Nevertheless, the main projects in this area are dedicated to well-known documents or printed books. This is not surprising considering the effort involved in manually enriching a document. This has led to a practice that de facto segments documents worthy of being enriched with TDI and excludes a huge number of minor sources. The hub is centered on artificial intelligence tools that do this work of transcription and even enrichment in an automated way. Just 2 days ago, a book was published, edited by Lise Jayland, entitled Archives, Access, and Artificial Intelligence, dedicated, as you can imagine, to exploring different approaches to making primary sources available and accessible with the help of AI. I wasn't not able to read the book completely for this conference, but I have the opportunity to see the article by Melissa Terras published there. She reviewed the reception of the transcript software and the handwriting text recognition technology by 155 users, half of them associated with academic institutions. Beyond their methodological aspects of the article, I am interested in highlighting one of her conclusions here, and I quote, HDR has the potential to provide a step change in historical method, focus, and relative findings in changing the scope from selecting particular manuscript material for digitization and transcription due to the costs involved to transcribing and analyzing complete archival collections. OCR and HDR technology is becoming cheaper, and even digitization of documents is more accessible to small archives and libraries thanks to microcomputers such as Raspberry Pi and Arduinos. Libraries like OpenCV and Python make much easier to manipulate images that can serve as a source for test machine learning models. Should this trend continue, the amount of digitized information accessible through computer searches will be staggeringly vast. After all, as Richard Marciano says, cultural collections are inherently big data. In this sense, the hermeneutics of historical documents will not be the same. The interest in idly lived through files may not be as attractive to an academic institution as the effective search for information in vast collection of historical data. The fragmented reading of sentence and paragraphs will necessarily be mediated by the algorithm dedicated to bringing the text to view. TI tagging is well received by the historian community because it's possible to search for the document and additionally view the original image, thus avoiding breaking the logic of reading document as has been traditionally done. In this sense, the transformation will be of the catalog, not of the reading. But wouldn't we be tempted or gluttony if we have all the information we dream of available to us, we don't require direct reading? How many of us try to retrieve keywords from Google Book or institutional database before diving into library shelves? Imagine your archive catalog, but instead of retrieving just titles and descriptions, you can create a program that can retrieve all the paragraphs that match your research. Imagine that your digital library gives you the possibility to process a century of data related to your research topic, and that you can filter, visualize, and reshape this information to ask any question. Would you turn down this feature just for the love of a traditional and seemingly more honest way of making history? Digitized sources are more than documents that have been transformed from atoms to bits. Its quality depends on the algorithm that transforms it, which can even fill in the gaps that deterioration has generated and create words totally dependent on the algorithm that detects patterns, light, tones, that separates the ink from the paper, or that detects the obverse or reverse. The thing with artificial intelligence is that not all outcomes can be controlled. The tests have a level of uncertainty that will hardly reach zero. Similar words, garble spelling, typing errors from the source can produce results that will be difficult to verify among millions of matches. The craft of history is definitively not the same in this setting. Although quantification is a possibility, it's not the goal. What is sought is true quantification made in machine learning models to recover the qualitative meanings that the documentation can provide. Paradoxically, the same models that can help Amazon know if you want a new pair of shoes may be the ones that can help identify patterns in the popular culture of peasants 2 centuries ago. Now, this makes sense if the promise of digitalization and total transformation of the documentation is fulfilled, which it might not be. Despite this scenario, an obstinate reader will have the option to go against the mass of programmers and decide in clear rebellion that he or she wants to read the files directly and not be subject to the authoritarianism of the algorithm. The problem is with today's sources that cannot be read as Droysen will read it in the 19th century. The moment the printing press ceases to be the main means of transmitting information, the obstinate reading of our rebel is doomed to failure. More digital sources are associated with features other than print sources. As Pereira and Araujo stated, we are in an era of updatism, a regime in which the memory of the past is constantly updated. In this sense, the originality of the document is somewhat irrelevant. It is more meaningful to identify the changed history of a document. Although in the production of physical document, the versions could be slightly different, there was always an original to refer in case of doubt. In digitality, change is part and form of the document itself. Wikipedia can be a very handy example, but in general, each blog post, web page, and even Facebook entry has a version history. My interest here is not to argue about the future of history books. I don't want to fall into the circle of hell where false prophets lay. I want to discuss the prospect derived from a paperless and especially objectless present, and therefore raise attention about the challenges that this could imply to historians. Also, I don't want to express a statement about how historians need to be digital or perish. As I said, even without paper documents digitized, historians still will have the possibility to dedicate their lives to scrutinize the text, smell the paper, touch the dry ink of every folio they want. Printers ran frantically during the last 2 centuries, so there is still a lot of paper to explore. Yet, the pace of last century printing's presence seems like a snail pace compared to today's digital networks. This brings us a greater problem that it's having a gigantic amount of documents to read. And that is that we no longer have documents, even files. We have lots of data, which takes form only through algorithms that make a request to complex databases. People don't read your apps and websites. Reading is the act of scrolling, and feeding those walls of items is the act of an algorithm. So should not we be a little more concerned with preserving these algorithms? Even more so than replicating archival techniques from the print age to store digital documents? Stubbornly, some historians still teach their students to read digital newspapers as if they were just electronic versions of a print edition. I have heard from my own students of some colleges forcing them to read only a few sections of a newspaper as if an e-journal were only a digital representation of a print one. What I want to remark here is that the loss of objectness in primary sources have been less discussed than the loss of materiality. In computer science, objects are well defined, and if defined are the sole inhabitants of an otherwise empty universe. This definition made by Tim Wrench is not particularly popular, but I think especially technopoetic. An object is, although what it builds it, a class is not. A class creates an object with a method which takes the variables and give them a form that is the object. The objectiveness is the quality to be an object. From a programmer perspective, this is almost useless. What the coder wants to know is how to define a class, which parameters include, and which methods will be necessary to construct in order to obtain the expected result. Programmers don't care if an object existent is associated with all other objects. Historians don't have the luxury. The objectivity of our science is strongly associated with the source, its materiality, and its type. Documents are key to reach directly or indirectly the reality of their producers. But data is not the same as document. Data are abstract and normalized records of reality. By their nature, they are incorporeal. They exist outside the support. In fact, they adapt to multiple supports. On the other hand, they always tend to disorder. The computer revolution has a lot to do with putting unstructured data in order. And to a large extent, the trend in artificial intelligence are related to natural language processing, which have to do with this disorder. The archive could be a mare magnum of papers, disconnected, unbound, incomplete, damaged. But even so, the files could be read piece by piece. Databases cannot be read item by item. Each field is unintelligible if its relationships, its keys, its primary and foreign keys are not taken into account. It is for this reason that web history preservation projects such as the Internet Archive devote their efforts to collecting screenshots of HTML displays as they were visible at a given time. Alexa Crowler, which founded this highly valuable movement, was born in the days of the static web, dominated by pages with limited interactivity. Each capture is a kind of object, a document. You can go to the Internet Archive and retrieve the front page of a newspaper on a certain date with no problem. But this method makes static what is dynamic. A screenshot made from Twitter will not be the same as a query made from my personal account or from someone else. Artificial intelligence allows the web to adapt to certain common trends. And it is not at all similar to a static capture. The nature of the contemporary web is performative. What makes the web what it is today are the action of scrolling, liking, sharing, commenting, posting, bookmarking, blocking, adding, listing, subscribing. At last, I want to talk about the hermeneutics of the collective reader. In our schools, it is common to understand the work of the historian in the form of recurrent mimesis. One historian reader, one document book, one author producer. However, as Alberto Romele points out, the digital employment implies a series of stratified processes and technology uses that are the result of a mediation between human and non-human double intentionality. Not to mention the fact that the designer does not work in solitude. She is usually part of a team in continuous contact with clients and the audience in a process of dialogical design. Hermeneutics, in this sense, changed significantly because it is not the reader or reading that gives meaning to the text, but the linking of intention between those who read, consult, those who write generate content, and the machines that design the way in which it is presented. If you notice, in the recurrent equation, what is lost is the document book, which is currently replaced by the machine. To close my accelerated intervention, I would like to highlight the fact that artificial intelligence or machine learning or computational processes are essential to understand the construction of information, text, images, and other objects that are currently visible. The object, aka document, is the result of the intersection between the design of the algorithm, the intentions of the creator, and the wishes of the readers. In this sense, it will be the task of historians to understand that the primary sources will be not so much these static captures or millions of digitized documents, but the very algorithms that give shape to them. It's largely counterintuitive because we didn't need to understand printing presses to know what a printout said. The fundamental difference is that movable types did not need to be moved by the reader to make the book. Well, I thank you to all for hearing, and I hope this could be understood.
Thank you very much, Jairo, and also congratulations for not being faced by the gigantic clock noise. I don't know if you've heard that, but it was yeah, you were completely unfazed, so very impressive. Thank you very much for that. We can now go over to the Q&A. We have some questions in the audience. Yes, let me get the microphone too. Or if you prefer, you can also sit here as you like.
No, I think I'll sit here. My technology is deciding. Yes, thank you, Pedro and Friedrich and Jairo, for your very challenging papers, and papers which I found quite difficult because of the limits of my knowledge. I'm going to try to I'm going to try to stimulate you to put the papers together in some sense. I think the papers do speak to each other without even having ever met each other. And I think that my level of familiarity is greatest with the material that Friedrich gave us, and probably least with Jairo's material. And my level of competence is also quite low with respect to Pedro's material. Let me start, however, with Pedro's paper. There's a certain, I wouldn't call it exactly abstraction, but there were generalizations that were being made, and often I didn't know what the actual meaning or content of the generalizations was. And perhaps Pedro might be able to put what he said into conversation with what the other two presenters gave us. PowerPoints don't necessarily equate with presentations or what people think, but I do take them seriously, and they can be helpful in this Zoom environment. Pedro, your sort of question at the front, and I know you went through various different stages in the production of this text, is what can history learn from media theory? And I don't know whether you want to answer this particular question, but my puzzlement was, after having heard the paper, was where's the media theory? I would like to hear, perhaps I would like to hear, if you think it would be useful to the audience, what exactly you mean by media theory, the actual content of the media theory you have in mind. And then your next PowerPoint, and I love PowerPoints because they make things clear, but perhaps misleadingly clear. And I know when next time I give a Loom lecture, I will definitely have a PowerPoint. And perhaps I'm just too aged to have thought of doing that. But anyway, next PowerPoint is a critique of digital historical reason. And you did define, in a certain sense, digital historical reason. You said it is the set, well, you just said it is set of assumptions. I think it means the set of assumptions, but maybe you don't. The set of assumptions and statements that frame the way technology and digital media are incorporated into historical practice. And perhaps if you would find it useful, you could, in some way, tell us more concretely what you mean by that digital historical reason. What are those specific assumptions? And of course, you're offering a critique of digital historical reason. So I'd like to see some clearer identification of the digital historical reason that you are criticizing. And then, of course, that gets us to the question of what exactly the content of your critique is. And I get some sense of the content of your critique from the material. And here I'm looking at my photographs of your PowerPoints. How would you do refer at one point to the core set of values and practices of historical writing, I guess, of historical writing. I hate the term historical writing. Historical representation, shall we say. What would you identify as the core set of values and practices of historical representation as it is currently practiced by historians? And I know you gave some examples, but they're kind of, to me, in a way, they remind me of things that I sort of experienced in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Serial history is pretty ancient. What are the core set of values? I will stop for the ringing of the bells. Yeah, they'll go on. Yes, I waited for that one that comes at the end. It's really, no, God. I think it's over now. So what do you see as the core set of values and practices of historians now? And how do you know that those are the core set of values and practices of historians now? And how would you change those core set of values and practices? And then that gets us to Friedrich's paper. And I know when you've just delivered a paper, it's hard to hear somebody else's paper. And Friedrich's paper was much more visible to me because I read a lot of Ricoeur. I don't think I really understood Ricoeur because Ricoeur wrote so much I could never put it all together. I was particularly struck by Friedrich's notion of the, I would think of it as the unresolving tension between mediation and distanciation. And I wonder whether that could somehow be related to what Pedro is talking about and to what Jairo is talking about. And of course, we're getting, when we start to talk about mediation and distanciation, we get to a point which I think Pedro didn't quite address. We're moving from the production by historians of historical representations to what ultimately for Ricoeur becomes the way that those representations are then integrated into the lives of the people who are encountering those historical representations. Of course, the process of mediation and distanciation occurs within the historical production itself, the production of the historical representation itself, but that then continues on onto the audience. And then we get to Jairo's paper. I was told earlier today that there is a machine, I think it's located in California, which can generate plausible sounding historical essays on just about any topic at all, better than the essays my students would produce. And I wonder whether that is actually true. I mean, I like to see things and then I can know it's true. Whether I would find any defect in these artificial, I mean, here we're getting to the level of artificial intelligence, which goes well beyond the, and I love HathiTrust. I love zlib.org, even though it's only semi-legal. I do actually usually first go to the electronically available text, and only then do I order from my library the physical text. But I think the deepest question here is the question that is raised by Jairo's pointing out, that increasingly we will be moving from a world where people, where the discourse of the world will be much more an electronic discourse than the printed discourse on which historians have so much relied on in the past. And in a way, the discipline is built on the possibility of, well, history as we know it, the academic profession of history, but also really even back as far as Herodotus and Thucydides, but we don't have their sources. You see, we don't know what Herodotus' sources were. We don't know what Thucydides' sources were, but presumably they were relying on the oral presentations of people, and maybe Thucydides did actually rely on some prior text. But now we're in the modern world. We're in the world in the world of printing by the 16th century, 15th century. And it was possible for a person like Ranke to rely on this unchanging set of material to which he could go back. That's the distanciation part. And then he could mediate it so that it became part of a narration that fitted itself within basically what was the national project, the international national project of 19th century, the 19th century European world. So now we're going into a situation where, notwithstanding the fact that there's the way back project, there's not the same reliability, there's not the same fixability of the texts. And often those texts, they're Twitter things that are simply momentary, conversations passing in the wind, as it were. So that clearly raises important problems. So I think I'll start with, I invite you as you wish, in whatever order you wish, but it's the chair to decide, to address these problems. But my initial questions were addressed to Pedro. Perhaps he might be willing to start. And then issues relating to Friedrich's and Jairo's papers can come in as they do.
Just hold on 1 second. There was a question about who you are, so maybe you can just identify yourself, because the camera is not very clear.
Okay, yeah, my name is Alan McGill, and I teach at the University of Virginia. So. Okay,
thank you. I think before maybe we take other questions, we could offer them to all speakers, because I think, as you point out, all of them can actually speak to all the questions.
I think so. Yes, I think
so. But let us indeed start with Pedro. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you for the questions, the very insightful questions. It is an honor to try to answer some of the comments you made. There's a lot to go through. I'll try to sum my arguments, but first of all, you are right. My paper has a high degree of generalization. It is, as I said, a summation of the major theoretical point. Actually, a theoretical point I made, I reached it after I presented my PhD dissertation. And it comes from especially the understanding of the challenges that these new technologies, new media, digital technologies, they pose to historiographical practice, and especially to the learning of historical methodology. So when I generalize, I'm thinking also concerning something that we could think of as the historical discipline in very broad terms. It is the way we teach students how to do their proper work as historians. So when I speak of a core set of values, I know the discipline is very diversified, but I'm trying to reach for this deepening, more deep, as I say, a more deep set of values. I know this don't answer very much, but I'll try to specify this. But the main thing is, so to start, you are right. I didn't offer the answer to my question. That is much because I presented this title and the abstract 2 years ago, and then 2 years later, I have developed the reflection another way, and I try to make them match. But that's no excuse. The question is, actually, the answer is, what is the answer to my question is that we should consider historical sources as forms of media. We should introduce the concept of media into the way we think about historical sources. And when I think about media and where is media theory, I'm thinking actually, this paper, I think I have made some mentions, for instance, regarding Simondon, Stigler, but one part of the answer should be media theory, another part should be the philosophy of technique. And this is something that I have reached in my PhD dissertation, because I was afraid. What I made in my PhD dissertation was, as I said, very pretentious work. I usually like to joke about it. It was a dissertation without method, without object, and without a problem. But nonetheless, it was approved. But the question is, I was trying to understand what were the main discourses around the adoption of digital technologies, digital methodologies in digital humanities and digital history. And as I further investigated, I found that what should be obvious, that digital history is only a form, one of the ways that historians have dealt with the computer. And there were other ways. Since the 1940s, at least, there was a myriad of ways that historians have dealt with the computer. So when I try not to buy into the discourse that validates digital history, as I said, as better than previous attempts to use the computer because it is more up to date, I have reached I have found the need to recur to the concept of technique, because it is the concept of technique that makes these that made me not to consider or to present another way of thinking about digital technology, not as tools which should function, but as more properly, and this is the bridge between the two, as media that operate. And this is it seems not so much of a difference, but it is actually a very important distinction, because, as I like to say, the question is, we should not think necessarily about a cultural or a social or a political history of technique, but we should think about a technical history of politics, a culture, or society. So we reverse the question. And when we reverse the question, we go away from these assumptions that frame, as I said, that culture should guard against techniques, that history should guard against technology, and that there is this privilege of the story over historical material. And so this is a very complex answer, but the answer is this: what should media learn is to reappraise technique, to consider historical sources as media, and considering it as media, it should relate especially to this that I call a opacity of media, because the way it seems to me that we as historians are trained to read historical sources is as if the sources were transparent. We investigate the conditions for their production, but we go from their physical, their material reality, as Jairo has pointed, towards the content. But their physical reality and material reality is, and is even digital. For instance, I'm not trying to correct you, Jairo, but it is not the transition from atoms to bits, because bits are also atoms. So there is also a material level there, and this intermediation between this relationship between matter and content is made by media. So matter, content, media, and techniques, they are all together. This is the main argument. And the media theory I'm thinking about is especially so to conclude this part of my answer. And it is especially this understanding, this broad assessment of media as mediation, something that, for instance, recently Alexander Galloway has proposed, and another researchers. This concept of digital affordances is really useful also, because it is what media enable, what digital media afford towards the relationship between subjects and the world, and especially media archaeology, because of the sorry. For me, it's
Somebody
not
wrote in the
that.
chat it's supposed to be 18 times.
We will begin again. So let me conclude. I'm sorry I spoke too much, but especially media archaeology and the work of Friedrich Kittler, because of the suspicion towards hermeneutics and this bodily material level of interpretation. It is also something that is very dear to me, and I think it's very useful. And as I said, I think something that connects my paper to Friedrich's is the way to think about media, and I could say technology, without speaking of technology itself. I don't, for instance, I could frame a discourse on digital history without recurring to the same instruments that digital history presents to validate itself. So I have another way to talk about, and this is very important to me. And towards this digital historical reason, it was, as I said, rightly lashed out. My supervisor did not agree with it, and he was right, I guess. But the question is, I try to read it from these statements that I collected. It was something that became very visible when I tried to understand how digital history predicants thought of their activities, that they were always setting it against something that was more durable, that was more permanent, that was traditional, and these were questions of method and historical reality, as if historical sources were not related to reality the same way that non-digital sources are. So it is from these statements that I concluded that there was this core set of values, at least among these practitioners of digital history. So I hope I have answered. Sorry,
Yeah. Could I make just one brief comment?
If it's very quick, yeah.
Yes. One thing I think you're a little bit backward in, how should I put it? I think most historians now are well aware of the Foucault point and of the Dominic Lecapre point, that historical sources are not simply documents. They are at the same time monuments. We know that now. And you're sort of going back, and Dominic Lecapre is a friend of mine, he's a brilliant guy. But that essay, when he talked about that, that was way back in the 1980s. There's been a tremendous change in the historical profession in the English-speaking world since that time. I think, just to take one example, the impact of the coming of women into the historical profession. You could believe in documents that were sold and fixed when there was only a single perspective that was privileged, and we're a little bit beyond that. So I think we know that, we historians do know that our sources are monuments at the same time.
Actually, I think you are
sorry,
right.
Pedro, sorry, Pedro, I don't want to interrupt, but it's just that I want to give everybody time to speak
Yeah,
and
yeah,
answer
sure.
some other
Sorry.
questions. So
Right.
maybe, yeah, you can talk
Later,
but I do want to give the floor to Friedrich to comment, please. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Alan. Yes, well, first of all, I should add that it is only a part of Ricoeur's historical phases that I mentioned. He started with 3, but later on added a 4th one, namely the reception of historical writings. Well, he still spoke of writings, but in my paper, I was actually intentionally mentioned historical representation. And yes, well, given the digitization, it is possible to historicize. That was a point I wanted to say, but perhaps it didn't say it clear enough, that the digitization of historical sources enables to view written documents in a historicized way. And I assume that it is not yet entirely clear what still will come out when further analyzing the stories, when written documents, be it the material or the way in which it is written, is being historicized, namely by contrasting it with digitized sources. The other point I wanted to underline that the accessibility, immediate accessibility, could blur the necessary distanciation towards historical sources. It is just, of course, that's clear in fact, but it could result in blurring and diminishing the necessary distance between the present and the other. But it is not only the perspective, I think, which needs the topic of perspectiveness, which needs reconceptualization, because that is too one-sided, only having a historian looking at something, but it is far more. And I think that this, the points because of which I mentioned Popper as well, may help this movement from one point of view to the other, continuous movement, not just mentioning an intertwinement, may help somehow further to be researched to prevent too static view of perspectivity. Well, that's just what first response.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to give the opportunity to Jairo to comment, and then I will give the floor to someone else who has a question. So in the interest of time, please don't make it too long if possible. Thanks.
I'm gonna be quick because I also want to hear more about Pedro. Your arguments are very, very interesting. I only want to say that, well, regarding to this machine learning that could make historical, he says, I think that the issue is not only that a machine can make an historical argument in some way, but how to criticize that argument that is made by the machine. And I think the way to criticize this argument is criticizing the algorithm that produced it. So is what I want to highlight in my presentation, is that we need to understand these kind of algorithms in order to be able to understand how they produce this kind of texts or images or discourses or narratives that we see, and that is gathering in our archives nowadays. So that's the essence of what I'm thinking about machine learning. I'm not very eager to go to machine learning is the greatest thing in the world, but neither going to machine learning is evil or something like that. I think we need to criticize it. Is the only thing.
Yeah, thank you. You had a question, right? You have a microphone.
Hello. Thank you. Those were really interesting papers. I'm thinking about genre as a kind of middle thing, maybe between, say, content and medium, but maybe also between like the individual historian's work of representing and then the pre-existing human concepts out in the world. So, Pedro, I appreciate how you're reorienting our attention from not just what the Twitter post says, but the media that underlies it. And I wonder what you might say about the genre of the Twitter post, which is afforded by the media, and it provides a home for content, but has its own sort of rhetorical conventions and its own sort of force that we might think of as having a politics and implications in the way that you're asking us to think of media. And then I'm less sure about this, but Friedrich, I wondered if you had anything to say about the genre of historical writing as maybe an interesting part of your story. It's clearly in Ricoeur's third stage, representation, but it occurs to me that it's also, it makes the work of representing look less individual and more involved with something that's pre-existing and maybe even documentary. So maybe it helps sort of prove your point about the entwinement. An invitation to talk about how genre might figure as a mediation in these papers.
Thank you for that. Pedro, do you want to go first, and then Friedrich?
Yes, I'll try to be more brief this time. Sorry for my previous
No worries.
answers. I think the person who made these questions also did not present herself, so I would like.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry.
My bad. This is my job. Yeah.
It's Courtney Weiss-Smith of Wesleyan University.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. Yes, I don't have much to add to what you asked. I think genre is a kind of mediation, or one of the mediation factors of how we access these contents, to use this word. But maybe I'm gonna go back to something that Alan posed earlier, and maybe this also qualifies as an answer to what you said. The question is, maybe another point I didn't make on my presentation is that I know that historians have read documents as monuments. They inquire into the conditions of production of the historical documents. But I think that even so, I think the question is, and I see this, for instance, even this conference, there is a deep attachment to the category of representation. And I think that when we think about media, we should go beyond representation towards mediation. Those are two very different categories. And for instance, this applies, I think this is useful. And for instance, if we will not know the conditions of production of every digital historical source, of every tweet, but actually, what is a historical source? It is a tweet, or is the tweet analyzed by a machine learning tool, for instance? But anyway, the question is not necessarily to understand these, for instance, digital sources as monuments that should be criticized in this way. We should criticize them, obviously, but maybe our critique should be made in another way. Our critique should focus on the understanding of the relationship between these media forms and our historical experience. Because as I said, political experience is way more different because we have Twitter, for instance, because we have these mediation tools, we have these media technologies, than because of the contents of every single tweet. Because first, we have too many tweets. Second, we have too many contexts for reception. And maybe what is more interesting, and this is the media archaeological approach, is to understand what were the conditions for the appearance of this media, and how do they tell something about, as I said, historical experience. I think this is the main question. I have another side question that is related to grammatology and the inscription, but actually, I don't know where to go with this, but I think it is also important. It is the understanding of media and kinds of inscriptions that should be focused backwards from digital media to analog media, for instance, to understand what historical sources are. But I leave it to another moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to give the word to Friedrich, although I am expecting bells ringing because it's every 15 minutes, but maybe not. So please go for it, Friedrich.
Well, Ricoeur, in his way how he distinguishes these phases he's talking about, he does skip the moment of important aspect of a discussion of historical representation. In the process to publish something, there's representation in it. There is before the discussions going on, and this in turn will affect the kind of how representation is organized, and it is certainly, there's a different organization of an argument if it is a book, a journal article, or some online publication. But I thank you for raising this point, but I haven't quite really thought enough about it. If this is somehow reply to your.
Thank you. If I may add something to the discussions, some loose questions, some thoughts. I do first want to congratulate you because I realize that you have picked interests which are only becoming more prominent in years to come. So that's pretty brilliant. I wish I thought about it myself, but maybe I still have time to change. So that's great. But in all seriousness, though, not knowing much about AI and so forth, but having said that, I wonder if it is not our profession, in light of these developments, if it is not, or our craft, actually, as you mentioned it, interestingly, isn't it going to be consigned now 100% to being an art, and this notion of it being a science slowly dissipating? And what does it say about history 50 years from now, 100 years from now? It's very dangerous to make those kinds of predictions, but maybe we're entering a phase like self-driving cars, where we're still going to be at the wheel for a while, but in just a matter of years, probably faster than all of us expects, will be no longer necessary to drive the cars. And then what are we going to do? Are we then going to just write interesting stories about the past? How is that going to look like? I mean, that's obviously very difficult to say, but I suppose that I will just stop by saying that we should all probably learn to code if we want to keep our jobs. But seriously, I mean, I can see this as being a serious part of honestly humanities in general. Yeah, I'm very fearful of these developments because, as I've said, I'm not very acquainted with all of this stuff. So I guess there's a self-interest involved in this question. But please, any of you that wants to comment on this, please do so.
If I can.
Yeah, please go ahead, Jairo.
Yeah, I think it's an honest fear to lose our jobs for a more technical development, but also I'm cautious with the future. I don't think that really all historians need to be skilled in programming or coding or so. What I think that we need to do as historians, and is a necessity, is to be more involved with technical specialists in order to help to answer some questions that maybe imply some repetitive tasks like searching documents or transcribing documents or making databases of that sort. But it's not necessarily something that we as historians need to do, but maybe to be aware that it's a tool that that we can use, and we can be helpful to build our arguments. It's like the digital archives, like for instance, PARES, Portal de Archivos Españoles, was a revolution for Latin America, and I don't know of any historian of Latin America that says that they don't want more digitized documents or that those searches will be more deep, but it's not their task to create the models and create the enhanced recognition and so forth, but maybe being aware that in those searches, in those retrieving of information, well, is a kind of black box that could mediate what we are receiving. And if the search and the visualization is more complex, for instance, if instead of a list of documents, you receive a network of documents, one network of keywords, then you need another skills in order to read or approach this kind of nodes of this kind of areas of information. So I think it's in that way. So don't quit your job. I think it's necessary to read deeply the documents and let the technician do their job.
Thank you. I remember your enthusiasm. Pedro, you want to comment?
Yes, I would like to comment. First, I think this is mainly, and this, I think Jairo agrees with this. This is mainly a labor issue than a epistemological issue, I think. I mean, I don't think we should fear technology or conflate our fear of technology with the fear that is very real, that we have diminishing investment, diminished funding for the humanities. And I have a theoretical point about this, and it is based, as I said, on my reading of technique. But the question is that humans and machines, for instance, they do not oppose themselves. They co-pose together. humans and techniques, human and tools, human and machines, they were always together. They, I think they will always be, nonetheless, the fact that machines should be more automatic. But automatization is not necessarily being autonomous. It is not that machines will control us, but the problem is the people who control the machines that control us. The question is more social than technological. So I think that we should, as we try, this is Simondon, as we try to guard our culture against technology, we ended up reinforcing this domination of a very limited concept of technology towards ourselves. So my first point is that we should not fear technology, but we should, in fact, fear the fact that technology is used to diminish the funding for the humanities. And regarding this and digital humanities, especially, there's a very insightful and very provocative article that was published in Critical Inquiry 2 or 3 years ago by Nancy Da. She is a professor of English in the Notre Dame University, and she questioned in this paper the funding for digital humanities, and that the whole money, the whole funding, the whole operations that were made did not justify the results that they were reaching. It is a really interesting point. It is not, she's not implicating, she's not, it is not, it is a really complex worked upon argument she makes against the digital humanities more broadly. And it is really interesting to understand this, the relationship between funding and epistemology that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. And just to be clear, because this is being recorded, I'm not a Luddite. I also think that, yeah, like Neuralink and other kinds of technologies can obviously make our job also much, much easier, which then enables a lot of other possibilities. Right. And actually, on the note of recording, I was thinking also while we were speaking that obviously it would be so fascinating to look back on this in 5 years, 10 years, and see where we're at. And I know that there are these debates about, these meta debates about historians when the computer was arriving. And sort of, yeah, you're probably aware of that, but it's an interesting way of positioning this discussion. Are there any other comments or questions? Or Friedrich, do you want to come in and add something?
Well, I assume, and hopefully the scientific seriousness of historical research will continue, but I wouldn't be surprised if the understanding what history is about would change. History is now not the same as it has been in the beginning of the 20th century. And I suppose it also depends how our future, the changes in what we expect from the future and what we need to know about the past to manage our future. That accordingly, our interest, not only our interest in specific episodes of the past, but our conception of history will change as well. It's rather abstract, but I suppose it will somehow, these steps will come as well.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Yes, there's a question in the audience. Please. And do identify yourself first, please.
Yeah, I'm Gabriel Serrano. I'm just here. Oh, yeah, sure. Very interesting presentations. Thank you very much for all of them. I was left wondering on the word mediation from both your presentations, Jairo and Pedro, because it seems that we want to move, let's say, beyond or maybe even before the paradigm of representation And this paradigm supposes, I think at its core, a figure of speech, which is a metaphor. So when we think about representation, we're always thinking about something that stands in for something else. And of course, we want to move, as I said, beyond or before representation. And we are starting to use the word mediation. But I was thinking, well, maybe mediation is just another form of saying representation, because when you speak about mediation, you suppose that there's something behind that which is mediating. So I was thinking that maybe we should just speak about media and the inscriptions in media in themselves. And I wanted to link this with the question of what is the source when we look at a tweet. And the source may be the context in which it is used. The source may be the ones and zeros that are inscribed electrostatically in some server in Iceland or something like that. But taking that into consideration, how should we think about this ever-changing historical sources? Because we're used to think that, well, historical sources are just like fixed and we can create new representations of them and insert them in new contexts. But what if the source itself is always changing? So there are just some thoughts that well, there's no one else, so maybe I said like, well, let's just share those thoughts with with the people that are here. And again, thank you very much. They were very enlightening and thought-provoking presentations.
Thank you for sharing. Does anybody want to comment on this? I do want to note that we're running out of time, so please be brief in your comments. I see you nodding, Jairo. You want to go first?
Yeah, just shortly. I think that question is one complete book. As I mean, it's very difficult to answer in just a few seconds. And I actually think that it's necessary to define very carefully this separation between mediation as the mediation of from the data to the reader, and well, this relationship with even the creator. This is not the same way as the representation, as the construction of this modeling of reality through text. It's very abstract, but I don't know if I can express myself in that way. And it's particularly how to understand these representations of sources that are every time changing. Well, that's particularly the challenge. Is how to do that is the question actually that we cannot answer today.
Thank
If
you,
I
Jairo.
could
Pedro, you want to
also,
comment?
yeah, very briefly, I think that the relationship between representation and mediation is that I think mediation is very different from representation, because mediation, it presupposes firstly the complexifying of the chain of representation of all those intermediaries between what is read and what is written about, for instance. But the question is more deep and I think more abstract, to follow Jairo. And then I could argue, I could answer that there is another metaphor that we usually don't think about when we think about historical sources, that is synecdoche. And historical sources are part of the past. They are part of a something greater. It is a historical source, historical vestige is what remains from the past. And we have a condition now, it seems to me at least, this is also some reasons from media theory, especially Villa and Flusser, but the question is that we have more, it seems that we have more vestiges than reality. We have more things said about reality than reality to check what is said. And this inverts this synecdochical relationship to historical sources and presents historical sources as something else. And in this way, historical sources will need to be created. It should be as genre mediations, it could be Azure mediations and material that feeds machine learning, and we don't know yet. But the main thrust of historical sources, which is it is part of the past, now becomes reversed. We have more vestiges than reality to check upon.
Okay, Pedro, thank you for that. I'll certainly raise your suggestion to the organizers of the conference. Okay, so we do have to end here, and I want to thank all of you really for a very interesting discussion. This was out of my comfort zone, and I think also some other people, so it was really, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.